We're going to review United States history by using a previously administered Regents exam, going through it step by step, working through the questions. This will give us an opportunity to review some of the material, but also to see how to approach these Regents questions. Notice this is an exam from June 1st, 2023. That's only last year. However, the new framework exams, you see here, are different from the exams that were given before June of 2023. If you look at older exams, they may be helpful in quizzing you, if you will, on U.S. history, but you're not going to see an exam that looks like that. The questions will be asked differently, and you need different skills to approach them. That's why we're starting with this one. Okay, United States history and government framework. Notice the government there. They do expect you not just to know the history, but also to know the principles of American government that you learned in history and be able to apply them to civic issues, historical processes, that sort of thing. Let's take a look at the multiple choice questions. Okay, so here we have our first set of multiple choice. You'll notice they're in sets. You're given a prompt, a brief passage, a document. It could be a map, it could be a political cartoon, it could be a graph of some kind, a chart, anything up here that you're meant to consider, analyze, and understand the context of. Use all the information you're given. Here we have a passage, and before we even read it, we look down here and see they give you the source. They generally will do that. The source, Thomas Paine, Common Sense, 1776. Something in that should ring a bell. 1776, of course, is the year we declared independence. You may remember Common Sense as the pamphlet, the book written by Thomas Paine that first advocated that the American colonies no longer fight for their rights as Englishmen, stop considering themselves as Englishmen, because they had become a new thing. We, said Thomas Paine, we're no longer Englishmen. We've developed our own culture, our own ideas. We are now Americans, a new people, a new ethnic group, if you want, a new nation. And so he begins to argue that we shouldn't be fighting the revolution that was already underway to get our rights under British law. We should be fighting for independence. All of that is stuff that you should remember from class before you even read the document. Let's take a look at it. Small islands, not capable of protecting themselves, are the proper objects for kingdoms to take under their care. But there is something very absurd in supposing a continent to be perpetually governed by an island. In no instance hath nature made the satellite larger than its primary planet. And as England and America, with respect to each other, reverses the common order of nature, it is evident they belong to different systems. England to Europe, America to itself. Okay, let's take a moment just to make sure everybody gets what's being said here. Small islands that can't protect themselves, not big enough for an army, not big enough not to be taken over, small islands, it's proper that big kingdoms take those little islands under their care. Okay, but he says there's something very absurd, something crazy, in supposing that a whole continent is going to be governed by a little island. The continent might rule the island, but a little island ruling a whole continent, to him that doesn't make sense. Well, what's he mean? England is an island. America is a huge continent. It's backwards that England should be ruling America. He says, in no instance hath nature made the satellite larger than its primary planet. Satellite here, he's talking about not the electronic gadget, of course, in 1776. The moon is the Earth's satellite. So just as the moon is smaller than the Earth, you never have the Earth revolving around the moon. Well, America belongs to itself. England is part of Europe. Clearly, the small island shouldn't be ruling the great continent. That's his argument here. Okay, so they ask you these questions. According to this passage from Common Sense, the author is doing what? Trying to convince Americans to remain English colonists? Seems to be just the opposite. Suggesting that the colonies join a European confederation against England. Well, where in here does he talk about America joining anyone else, even if it is to fight England? Proposing that the colonies revise the Articles of Confederation. Well, you got two problems. The Articles of Confederation won't be written until after this, so he can't tell them to revise a document that doesn't exist yet. You might not remember that, but clearly he makes no reference to rewriting any documents in here or talking about the Articles of Confederation at all. Well, what's he doing? Urging Americans to become independent from their mother country? That seems to be the only one that fits. Be careful here, according to this passage. In this case, that's right. Sometimes they'll throw a correct answer in here from history, but it's not actually in the passage. So when you read the question, you have to make sure the answer you think is right is somehow actually reflected in here. Now, here is a key thing. It will not have that line in it. If you're trying to match a line in one of the answers to a line up here, it's not going to happen. And if it does, you better be very suspicious of it, because it's a trick. They want you to read this passage and figure out what it means in your own words, if you like, and that's what they're going to ask about. They're not going to ask a question where you just find the sentence here that matches the sentence here. So be careful of that. That's very important on the new style Regents exam. Number 2, what is the primary argument used in this passage by Thomas Paine to make his point? Once again, you have to figure out for yourself what is the point he's trying to make. There is no economic relationship between America, colonies, and England? Does he ever imply that? No, he talks about the fact there is a connection. One is trying to rule the other. England cannot effectively govern the colonies because America is so much larger. When you get that, hang on to it. Make sure you read all of the choices because you want to pick the best one, not just say, oh, that sounds pretty good, jump to that and not even read the rest. Number 3, the American colonies are already allied with France and do not need England. Does he talk at all about American alliances with other countries? And in fact, if you remember, and you may not, the alliance with France does happen during the Revolution, but again, years after this. So he can't be talking about it yet. And he doesn't mention anything in here that sounds like an alliance or making deals with other countries. Number 4, England has denied the colonists any form of self-government. Does he actually say that in here? Now, this is one you might jump to, because he talks about the little island ruling the great island. But does he say that England has given the colonies no amount of decision-making for themselves? He doesn't really. This is the tricky one. This is the one they throw in that sounds kind of right, but if you think about it, it's not quite on point. He never says that England gives America no ability to decide things for themselves here. He just says they're the ultimate ruler. They're the last word. So that one, in fact, doesn't fit. But that's the one that lazy guys are going to maybe jump to. England cannot effectively govern the colonies because America is so much larger. If you look at it, all through it, that's what he keeps talking about. America's a huge continent. England is a small island. The small island cannot govern a big continent. And that really is the best answer here. Once again, I'm going slowly through this, I know, but you got to get the principles up front. Be careful. Read all the answers. Don't jump at the first one that sounds good. Read them all, and you probably will find two that kind of sound like they could be, but one is going to be, if you like, more correct or more on point. So number 2 here is the right answer. Okay, let's move on to the next one. Let's move on to the next one here. Again, the questions are going to come in pairs, sometimes 3, about your prompt. So here we have, again, always look at the information they give you. The Federalist, number 51, 1788, James Madison. It would be great if that triggered a memory. James Madison, one of the framers of the U.S. Constitution. He will later be a president. That comes later on. Friend of Thomas Jefferson. James Madison, along with Alexander Hamilton and John Jay, wrote a series of letters to the editor of New York newspapers that came to be called the Federalist Papers. Each of them they all wrote different numbers of it. Originally it was anonymous, although scholars since have figured out pretty sure who wrote which ones. And they're numbered. So there are a total of 85 of these letters or essays in which, if you remember, these 3 guys, Madison, Hamilton, and Jay, take each bit and piece of the new proposed Constitution, explain it, and then try to make a case as to why Americans should support and approve, ratify this new Constitution. They're great, the Federalists, for us because they are commentary on what they actually meant when they wrote the different pieces. So today, the Supreme Court, when they're trying to figure out, well, exactly how do we interpret this line in the Constitution, they can go back and look at the Federalist, and the Federalist is not law. It's not the last word, but it is a pretty good commentary from the guys who wrote it as to what they thought they meant by it. And so, 1788, we see that's just at the time that the Constitution, written in 1787, was in the process of being ratified. Okay, then we read the document. The policy of supplying, by opposite and rival interests, the defect of better motives, might be traced through the whole system of human affairs, private as well as public. We see it particularly displayed in all the subordinate distributions of power, where the constant aim is to divide and arrange the several offices in such a manner that they each may be a check on the other, that the private interest of every individual may be a sentinel over the public rights. These inventions of prudence cannot be less requisite in the distribution of the supreme powers of the state. Okay, well, that's kind of old-fashioned language, right? So let's think about what it actually means. This policy, whatever it is he's talking about, of supplying by opposite and rival interests the defect of better motives, might be traced through the whole system of human affairs. Okay, you have to know a bit to know what he's getting at. Like, you have to remember stuff, yeah? Opposite and rival interest. I have my interest in what I want to get out of let's say, a business deal. You have your interest at your side. You want, let's say, the best price. I want to make the most profit. So we have rival interests. Because I'm pushing for a good profit, I'm not going to let you rip me off. But because you're pushing for the lowest price, you're not going to let me rip you off. And so at the end of it, when we finally come to the bargain, by sort of pushing against each other, we get to, you hope, something that's sort of fair. That's what he's talking about. He says we see it particularly displayed in the lesser distributions of power, where the constant aim is to divide and arrange several offices that they each may be a check on each other. That should be a trigger word for you. Check and balance. The president cannot make law on his own. Congress has to pass laws, but the president can veto. The president and the Congress, when they make law, they have to answer to the Supreme Court, which decides whether that law fits with the Constitution. So checks and balances. So what he's really saying is, when it comes to the supreme powers of the state, and by here, look, it's capital S. He doesn't mean the state of New York. He means the country as the state, like the state of France or the state of Germany. So when it comes to the United States, you want ultimate government power divided up between people who will be pushing against each other out to keep the power as much as possible for themselves, but because they're pushing against each other, each branch of government will keep its proper power and no more, because there's a guy on the other side pushing back. And that way everything stays fair, and no one guy can become, or no one branch can become dictatorial. Okay, so this is what he's going for here. Now we look at the actual questions. What was the primary reason James Madison wrote this and the other Federalist Papers? This is a straight-up memory question. You have to remember what this was in the first place, because you don't really find the answer in the document. So this is a context question. So you have to remember that the point of it was to support the ratification of the Constitution. Ratification, approval. They wrote the Constitution in the Constitutional Convention, and then they had to send it out to the states, and each state had to approve it. You should remember, too, initially, the first few states, like Delaware, passed it without a problem. By the time it got to New York, people were starting to question, are we giving the government too much power? What's going to prevent it from becoming too interfering in people's lives? How do we protect the different branches? Maybe we should have a committee to be president. This sort of thing. And so this is a sort of memory question. Nothing here else makes sense. It was not to encourage development of political parties. Remember, when the framers wrote the Constitution, they did not necessarily foresee there would be political parties the way we think of it. That all happens later. They were not looking to increase ties with Europe. We were off on our own and a new country, and happy at that. And the whole national bank controversy, you may remember, that happens years later. That has nothing to do with this. Which constitutional principle does Madison most directly describe in the passage? Creation of a powerful military. Is there anything here about the president's power as commander-in-chief or any of that? It doesn't really say anything about that. Support for the rule of law. Well, the rule of law, that is, you have to follow the law and not just what's popular at the moment, even if the majority of people like it, that sort of idea, that's not really here. He's not talking about that. He's talking about the different parts of government pushing against each other. Reserving the power of judicial review. Judicial review is the right the Supreme Court has. I shouldn't even say the right, but like the role let's say, the Supreme Court has in our government of holding everybody accountable to the law, the ultimate law being the Constitution itself. That power of judicial review the Supreme Court has is its way of pushing back against the other two branches. That's true, and this is sort of that distractor there that you might say, well, I kind of remember that, and that was its check. But it's not the best answer. Separation of powers between the branches, that's the best answer here. He's not just talking about the court, he's talking really by implication about the basic idea of dividing up government power, so that by separating it into the branches in the first place, it will keep the branches pushing against each other, each guy stays in its right place, and it is protects public rights against tyranny. Okay, let's move on. Questions 5 and 6. What's our source? Max Lerner, Wounded Titans. American Presidents and the Perils of Power, 1996. We'll take a look at this for a minute, just real quick, and we see he's talking about Jefferson. Well, Jefferson is not 1996. Aha. Some of these documents won't be primary sources, they will be secondary sources. That is, historians writing about history, not the actual document from the time itself. You guys know this. Therefore, when you look at this, you are getting an historian's interpretation of history. If you look at the very title, this sometimes is a help. Wounded Titans. Titans being those ancient Greek gods, even before, if you know your Greek history, even before Zeus and Apollo, these are the sort of the elder gods. Wounded Titans, so these are damaged gods. Ooh. American Presence and the Perils of Power. We can guess that maybe he's talking about presidents and the trouble they get into when they exercise power. It winds up backfiring. Maybe it's something like that. 1996, so it's a more recent document, history guy writing about history, and it's his interpretation. All right, now we look at it. When the British and French both seized American vessels, if they touched the ports of the other, Jefferson decided to test one of his favorite doctrines, that war was both intolerable and unnecessary, and that the best weapon against both powers lay in economic sanctions. He got Congress to pass a series of 5 embargo acts, stringently forbidding U.S. trade with Britain and France, not only overseas, but even along the Canadian border. Okay? Pretty easy, but let's just take it apart for a moment. British and French. Jefferson. So we're talking about the very early 1800s. We're talking about the Napoleonic Wars, if you remember that. Britain and France at war with each other. American vessels. So these are U.S. ships. If they touched at the ports of the other. That's a little bit actually of a technical phrase. To touch a port in those days, if you were a ship, was to pass at a port or to pass by a port, sort of like a toll booth, or actually stop at the port to import and export stuff. So if an American ship stopped at a French port, the minute it got back out into the sea, the British would take it. And the French did the same thing. If an American ship went to England, to London or Dover, one of the British ports, the French would be waiting for it to grab it. This was a way to punish the United States for helping their enemy. So if we were trading with Britain, the French were going to seize our stuff to teach us a lesson, and vice versa. That puts us in a tough position because Britain and France were America's by far hugest trading powers. They were the biggest people that we had any business with. And therefore, if we stopped doing business with either one of them or both, boy, were we slitting our own throats economically, wasn't helping us at all. So Jefferson is faced with this problem, and it's really difficult. Should we go to war with the British or the French or both to push back, punch them in the nose for stealing our stuff? Jefferson held that war was intolerable, should not be tolerated, and he thought war was unnecessary. That you could fight back with economic sanctions. You guys should know what that is. Economic has to do with money and trade. Sanction is, in this sense, a kind of punishment. So we could punish them with our economic business. He goes to Congress and talks them into passing the Embargo Acts, which forbid U.S. trade with Britain and France until they cut it out, was the idea, not only overseas, but even with the Canadian, along the Canadian border. Canada, you remember, is still, at this time, belongs to Britain as a British colony. So Jefferson says, all right, we're going to punish you both. We're not going to trade with either of you. You might remember, and you just use your logic, right? You're smart guys. Who does that hurt most? Doesn't hurt Britain and France most. It hurts us. We're shutting down all of our foreign trade. Okay. According to this passage, what was Jefferson's primary objective in proposing the Embargo Acts? To raise revenue. You raise revenue by tariffs, that is, taxes on imports. He's shutting down imports. Can't be to raise revenue. To limit the slave trade. The slave trade was not really affected by this. The slave trade would be going on for another few years in the United States, but the slave trade was mostly with Africa. It was not with Britain and France. To increase trade, it does just the opposite. So the only right answer here is to avoid war. War is intolerable and unnecessary, so the way to not have a war is to force them by economic sanctions to leave us alone. That's what he thought. But notice, now we get to this question. What was one result of the failure of the Embargo Acts? What do you think happens as a result of the Embargo Acts? They fall apart because you've just destroyed the American economy by refusing to trade. And Britain and France are not dumb. They know that that's going to happen, and so the Embargo Acts disappear. Well, what's one result of this? The Missouri Compromise? That makes no sense. Missouri Compromise was about what do we do with new states that come into the country, and will they be slave states or free states? You remember this one? That has really nothing to do with this, and it comes many years later. Louisiana Purchase. Really, again, has nothing to do with this. The Jefferson purchased Louisiana from the French. It was actually a business deal he did with the French. They needed cash. They weren't going to do anything with their land in North America, so they were willing to sell it to America at a pretty cheap price because they were so hard up for cash. It really doesn't have anything to do with the Embargo Acts. We were not importing and exporting stuff there. In fact, just the opposite. If you remember, good fact to remember, the point of the Louisiana Purchase was really so that we could use the port of New Orleans at the bottom of the Mississippi River. That gave us access to the whole Mississippi, which really, the Ohio River, goes from Ohio and what's now Ohio, Illinois, Indiana, to the Mississippi, then down south through New Orleans. So it gave farmers in the Midwest a way to trade with the world. Louisiana Purchase really didn't have anything to do with the Embargo Acts. Gibbons v. Ogden. That's one of those basic Supreme Court cases you need to know. Gibbons v. Ogden, again, has nothing to do with this. This was the ferry boat case across the Hudson River. Gibbons and Ogden were running rival ferries from New York City to New Jersey. And New York State wanted to shut one of them down. They wanted to give a monopoly to one ferry operator. And the Supreme Court said, because you're crossing a state line, that ferry boat is engaged in interstate commerce, New York State to New Jersey. New Jersey could not regulate that. Neither could New York. Only the federal government can regulate interstate commerce. So that's what that Supreme Court case was about. Has nothing to do with this. The War of 1812. What's the trigger for the War of 1812? You may remember was a complicated bit of stuff, but the trigger for it was the British. The French were seizing American ships, but the British were doing it much more. And the British were taking the sailors on those ships and drafting them into the British Navy, even though they were American citizens. Because they wouldn't back off, no matter what economic sanctions we put on them, we finally, in 1812, and this is under James Madison, who we just talked about, when he's president, after Jefferson, we wind up going to war with Britain in the War of 1812 over this very problem. So that's the correct answer here. Because the Embargo Act failed to work, we wound up in the War of 1812. Let's do a couple more. 7 and 8. We got a passage here. This is the first inaugural address of Abraham Lincoln. Okay. Abraham Lincoln, the guy who invented the $5 bill. No, he didn't invent the $5 bill. His face is just on it. But we know, president during the Civil War. Inaugural address, again, you should remember, the president's inauguration. Inauguration just means beginning of something. And so it's the beginning of his presidency. It's when he takes his oath of office. Traditionally, presidents give a speech. They take their oath, and then everybody sits down, and the president gives a speech about, what he hopes to do as president. March 4th, 1861. Presidents today are sworn in January. We made that change as a country in the 1930s. But in Lincoln's day, you got elected in November, but you didn't actually take office till the following March. 1861, okay, and you perhaps remember April, so a month later, a little more than a month later, the Civil War breaks out. So the Civil War has not happened yet. Lincoln has been elected president. He gives his speech on the day he becomes president, and this is what it is. Apprehension seems to exist among the people of the southern states that by the accession of a Republican administration, their prosperity and their peace and personal security are to be endangered. There has never been any reasonable cause for such apprehension. Indeed, the most ample evidence to the contrary has all the while existed and been open for their inspection. It is found in nearly all the published speeches of him who now addresses you. I do but quote from one of those speeches when I declared that I have no purpose, directly or indirectly, to interfere with the institution of slavery in the states where it exists. I believe I have no lawful right to do so, and I have no inclination to do so. Okay, so let's take it apart again. Apprehension. Here, this word in this context means worry. Worry seems to exist among the people of the southern states that by the rise to power of a Republican administration, their property and peace and personal security are to be endangered. Remember, Lincoln is the first Republican president. The Republican Party was founded in 1856. Their first presidential candidate, you probably don't remember this, was a guy named John C. Fremont. and his campaign headquarters was right here on Staten Island in Stapleton. George William Curtis, for whom Curtis High School is named, was one of the original founders of the Republican Party. Curtis was an abolitionist. The Republican Party was for people who did not like slavery. And be careful how I said that. It included outright abolitionists who wanted to make slavery go away yesterday. It included people who thought slavery should go away over time. We should gradually get rid of it. It included guys like Lincoln, who was a free soiler. The Free Soil guys said, leave slavery alone where it exists. Let's hope someday it dies out on its own, but we won't extend it into new states out west as new states are being formed, out by like the Rocky Mountains and stuff. So they weren't going to touch it in the South, but they weren't going to expand it. All of those people, outright abolitionists, radical abolitionists, gradual abolitionists, free soilers, none of them felt at home at the time in the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party was the pro that slavery is an American institution and we need it for our economy and so on. So they founded the Republican Party. In 1856, they ran John C. Fremont. As I said, his campaign headquarters was in Stapleton, here on Staten Island. He lost, but the Republican Party became the second biggest party in America. In 1860, Lincoln runs. He wins. And immediately, Southern states panic. Lincoln is elected in November of 1860. By December of 1860, he's still not president yet, South Carolina announces it is seceding from the United States. January, February, into March, Southern state after Southern state passed laws, resolutions in their state government announcing that they were leaving the United States. Don't forget, by the way, no matter what you see on the internet or on X or on Twitter or on TikTok or nuts with websites, every single state in the South that left or claimed to leave the United States, every one of them cited as their reason for doing so that they were afraid slavery would be taken away from them. There are people who try to say now that the Civil War was about a lot of other things and slavery really didn't matter, and that's not really what it was about. Well, there were a lot of factors in the Civil War, it is true, a lot of factors. However, the number one cause that they all cite for saying we are leaving the country is to protect slavery. Lincoln had said, as he says here, over and over, had said, I am not going to interfere with it in the states where it exists. Lincoln said, I don't think I can, and I don't really want to. I don't want to extend it. I hope it dies someday, but I'm not going to touch it where it is. You have nothing to worry about. But the southern states did not believe that, no matter how much he said it. And so when he becomes president, he stands up and says again, you have nothing to worry about. I am not going to do anything about slavery in Alabama and Missouri and Arkansas and Georgia and Florida and any of those places. They didn't believe him. They continued, and in April of 1861, the shooting starts and the Civil War actually begins. Okay, here's the questions. What is one reason Lincoln included these statements in his address? To encourage expansion of slavery in the West? No, he was exactly against that. His policy of free soil was the opposite of that. To increase support of Northern abolitionists? No, Northern abolitionists were a little uncomfortable with Lincoln. They wanted a more radical guy. They wanted a guy who would actually go after slavery in southern states, and Lincoln kept saying he wouldn't. So they would have been happier with somebody else, but at least he wasn't pro-slavery, so to speak, so they kind of lived with him. So he wasn't looking to increase their support. He's already president. He doesn't have to run. He doesn't have to get more votes. To reestablish the foreign slave trade. The foreign slave trade had been shut down by the country in 1808. It was done. There was slave trade inside the United States, but you couldn't import slaves from outside. Lincoln was never interested in doing that, and there's nothing here that talks about it. To reduce the fears of slaveholding states. That's the answer. Lincoln wanted to calm them down. Everything will be okay. You have nothing to worry about. Which later action by President Lincoln demonstrated a change from his 1861 position? Okay. Signing the Pacific Railway Act. You may remember this one. This is the Transcontinental Railway. They had decided to build a railroad that connected everything east of the Mississippi with California. It was to, I'll say this, it was to settle, one of the reasons for it was to settle a lot of non-slave type people, not promoting slavery out in those western states. But it's not really, Lincoln would not have been in favor of expanding slavery to the west anyway. So that's not a change. Appointing William Seward Secretary of State. Seward had been governor of New York. He was a screaming abolitionist. He had tried to run against Lincoln for the Republican nomination for president, and he lost. But Lincoln made him Secretary of State anyway. That's not a change. Lincoln did not change his position. Right away, as he's saying this, he's appointing Seward Secretary of State. He wanted Seward to handle foreign affairs. Suspending habeas corpus. If you remember this one, Lincoln established military courts to arrest people who were accused of helping the southern states. That was a very controversial decision on his part, to try people not in civilian courts, but in military courts if they were thought to be sort of spies and agitators and saboteurs on behalf of the South. Also, nothing here. Emancipation Proclamation. If you remember the purpose of the Emancipation Proclamation, it was declaring any slave that was still in slavery in the South, in a state that was still in rebellion, they were declared to be free. It really didn't free any slaves. If you're in Georgia, and Georgia still recognizes slavery, and Georgia is still at war with the government, the U.S. government, Lincoln declares the slaves of Georgia free, but nobody in Georgia is going to pay attention to that because they don't think Lincoln is legitimately president. So the slaves did not actually get to walk away as a result of it on a practical level. But it did represent Lincoln announcing, kind of, that he recognized the war could not end any other way than with the abolition of slavery. The real people that was meant for, the Emancipation Proclamation, was Europe. The South could never have won the Civil War without a lot of help in money and equipment and material and manufacturing capability from Europe. Britain and France had already abolished slavery. As long as Britain and France could tell their own people, that civil war over there in America is really some kind of bizarre fight they have about states' rights and constitution, and we don't really get it, but whatever. Then Britain and France could continue to help the Confederates. When Lincoln issues the Emancipation Proclamation, even though on a practical level no slaves really got to walk away, it said to the world, this war is now for sure, can't deny it, about slavery. And Britain and France could no longer tell their own people that, their people would not have supported the government helping slavery. They might have supported helping this Confederate government if it's about something else, but they couldn't support slavery. Britain and France completely back away from the Confederacy, and that's a big reason why it all starts to go downhill for the South from then on. Okay, we'll leave it there. This is about a class period's worth, and you can pick up in the next video if you want, and we'll do the rest of this test.